Hello, welcome back to part 2 of 9 for chapter 2, looking at biochemistry. And so we pick back up with trying to understand the difference between being chemically reactive and chemically not reactive, or part of that noble group of gases. And again, putting this together, what does it mean to have a valence electron? What does it mean to be full in the outer shell? What does it mean to be able to react, right, and engage in chemical bonding? And so this is where we pick up. This is what this slide here is looking at. And so if we look here, right, we've got side A, we've got side B. Side A are our stable elements, right? What we refer to as inert or not reactive. And what makes things like helium and neon and krypton and argon chemically inert, or again, those noble gases, what makes them non-reactive is that their outer shell, those valence electrons are completely full. Right? There is no room to add anything else. Right? And the goal of all of our atoms is to have a full valence shell. The goal of each atom is to have a full valence outer shell. Right, that is our goal. So if we look at helium, helium has one shell, one energy shell, all right, and that first energy shell can hold how many electrons? 2. How many electrons does it have? 2. And so helium is stable. Right? It doesn't want to give anything up, and it can't take anything. If it took another electron, you'd have to add another shell, and then it would be not happy. That outer shell would not have a full valence count. And look at neon. Neon has 10 protons, which means it has 10 electrons. Right? Well, follow this out. It's got 2 on the first. All right? That makes it full. All right? It has 10 total, so we've got 8 left over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, there it is. Right? It is full. Right? It's stable. It's not going to go anywhere. It meets the requirement. How does that differ from our chemically active elements? Well, look, here's one energy shell, and we know that in order for this energy shell to be full, it wants 2 electrons. But how many does it have? It's only got one more, or it's only got one. It wants one more, and in wanting one more, it's chemically active. Okay, and so this is going to be reactive. It's going to be reactive until it gets one more. Well, we're going to look at it in video 3 and 4. We're going to look at how this all happens. All right. Let's look at carbon. All right. Carbon has 6 protons, which means it has 6 electrons. It's got 1, 2 on the first shell, so that's full. Great, but it's got another 4 electrons because it's got 6 total. All right. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4. It wants how many? It wants 8, but it only has 4. So it has a decision. It can either gain 4 more through bonding, or it can give away 4 through bonding to go ahead and have, again, the goal being a full valence shell. If it gains 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, if it gains those 4, that outer shell is now full. If it gives away 4, then we drop back down to this first shell, and it's full. Right? So again, that's the key. Right? Look at oxygen. Oxygen has 8 protons, and we know that the number of electrons and the number of protons, according to the atomic number, is equal. So we expect 8. We expect 8 electrons. Well, same thing. 1, 2 on the first energy shell, right? But it's got 8 total, so that's how many left over? 6. Right? 6 left over. Is that what we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It wants how many more? It wants 2 more. It wants 2 more. And if it gets 2 more, it has 8. Right? So how does it do that through bonding? We're going to get there. Right? Let's look at sodium. Sodium has 11 protons, so its atomic number is 11, which means it has 11 electrons. What does that mean? Well, it means the first energy shell has 2. Right? So there's 9 left. Right? But not all 9 can fit on the second shell because the second shell holds 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right? So, but we've got 11, so we've got 1 more. So there it is right there. And now, sodium has a decision. Is it, through bonding, easier to give up that 1, or is it easier to take 7 more? Well, as we're going to discover, it's a lot easier for it to give away 1. And if it gives away 1, what happens? You drop back down to this energy shell, which is full. Right? So the goal of all of these other elements is to be like the noble gases. It's to be like the noble gases. And the way that they do that, the way that we reach full valence electron shells, is through chemical bonding. The key is chemical bonding. And when we engage in chemical bonding, we engage in trading out. We engage in swapping electrons. Sometimes we engage in sharing of electrons, depending on the type of bonding that we do. And so that's where we're going. This is what we need to be able to look at. All right, but before we do that, we have to look at a few other little things. All right, so one of those things is when we talk about giving and or taking electrons, because remember, it's those electrons on the outer shell, those valence electrons, that are going to be engaging in all of this chemical bonding. Well, if an atom gains electrons, we refer to that as an anion. Right? We refer to that as an anion. So an atom that has gained electrons is what we define as an anion. An atom that has lost an electron or 2 or 3, right, it's given the electron away, we call it cation. And we say that that atom now has a net positive charge. How does something have a negative charge or a positive charge if the goal is to have an outer shell that is full? Well, let's think about this. Let's look at sodium. Right, let's look at sodium. Right, sodium is happy and balanced. Right, it's net neutral. Right, its charge is neutral. Why is that? Well, because it's got proton-wise. Hold on one second. This is a bad example. Let me come back over here. Okay, so let's come back over here. Let's look at sodium. All right, sodium has 11 protons and 11 electrons, right? Well, what happens now if we give up one of these electrons? What if we create a cation? Because cations, by definition, are atoms that give up an electron. So what happens if we give up an electron? How many electrons do we now have? We no longer have 11 because we've given it away. We have 10. We have 10. And that's what you're seeing right here. What you're seeing right here is sodium has given up one of its 11 electrons. So when it does that, it has 11 protons and now only 10 electrons. It has one more proton than electron, which means it's 1 plus or plus 1. That plus 1 means that it has one more proton than electron. It has 11 protons and 10 electrons. That plus 1 means it has one more proton than electron because it gave up the electron. And it gave that electron up and created a cation, which has a net positive charge. There's the net positive charge. All right. Now, chlorine, we have not talked about chlorine yet. Chlorine well, that's a horrible color. That's not much better. Chlorine has 17 protons and typically has 17 electrons. Right? So what does chlorine look like if it is normal? Well, chlorine looks like, on the first energy shell, it has 2 electrons. On the second energy shell, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's got 8 electrons. That's 10, right? How many total? 17. So we have 7 more. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It needs one more electron. It needs one more electron. Chlorine. Well, if sodium gives up an electron, and chlorine needs an electron, it takes it. Right? It takes it. And so what happens here? Right? We now have 1, 2 on the first shell. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 on the second shell. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and we now have 8 on the valence shell. That shell is now full. But when it's full, it now has how many electrons? It has 18. It started with 17, but it now has 18. So we have 18 electrons and 17 protons. One more electron than proton, which is where that comes in. It has a negative charge because it has one more electron than proton. Right? Now, ironically, here's what happens. When sodium gives chlorine its electron, because it wants to get rid of one, and chlorine desperately wants it, sodium then binds to chlorine, and you have sodium chloride, or table salt. Now, that's a special kind of bonding. We're going to talk about that. But That's how you get sodium chloride. Sodium gives chlorine one of its electrons. And then, get ready for it. When that happens, this plus one, because it's got one more proton than electron, does what to this negative one because it's got one more electron than proton? If I give you $1 and then take the dollar back, how many dollars do you have? 0. You're neutral. This molecule of sodium chloride is neutral because everything is once again balanced out. Independently, you've got an ion. This is an ion. Right? Specifically, it's a cation if it's sodium, or it's an anion if it is chlorine or chloride. But combine them together and you've got neutrality. Plus 1 minus 1 cancels each other out. The next thing that you need to understand is that we use this method of bonding, whether it is a giving and taking of electrons to create anions and cations, or whether we are sharing electrons, which is something that we will get into shortly. We have different types of chemical reactions that can take place. So, in the first example, we have molecule A that we're combining with molecule B, and we create a new molecule, AB, sodium chloride, to produce sodium chloride. Right? In that example, what we have done is we've done a synthesis reaction. RXN means reaction. Synthesis means to create. We've taken two individual things and we've created something new. We've taken sodium and chloride and we've created sodium chloride. All right? Now, the opposite of a synthesis reaction is what you see in the second picture. This, you're starting with, let's say, sodium chloride, but then we split apart the molecule into its two individual atoms. One being an anion, one being a cation. Or I should say one being an anion and one being a cation. Right? When we split apart a molecule into two separate components, we call that decomposition. Reaction. We're decomposing, we're breaking down something complex into something that is more individual. All right. Now, the next reaction type that you have, and by the way, these are all things that do happen within the body. Right? And we'll give you some examples of these guys as we go through the course. So let's look at example 3. Here we have molecule AB plus C. And after the reaction, C and B switch. They switch places. Right? We refer to this type of reaction as a single replacement reaction, because you are switching the places or the locations of two atoms. Right? If you do that for two atoms, as what you see right here, let me change my color again. If we do that with two molecules, so you have AB plus CD, which creates AC plus BD. All right. Again, the B has switched places. All right, and the C has switched places. All right, so now that the C is with the D and the B is with the A, all right, so you've switched two things. So guess what we refer to that as? A double replacement reaction. All right, and so what are some examples that we see? Well, an example of a synthesis reaction is what we're going to be talking about later on in like video 5 or 6, where you actually start to maybe link together amino acids to create a protein. That's a synthesis reaction. Or sodium and chloride. All right? You're taking two individual things and joining them to make something more complex. Decomposition would involve taking that big thing and now breaking it apart into smaller pieces. This is what happens when you've got stored energy within your liver or your muscular cells. Right? So you're working out, you're lifting weights. Your muscles store something called glycogen. Glycogen is all of these little glucose molecules that are bound together. Right? Well, your muscles, now you're lifting, you're working those muscles out. They need glucose. They need glucose to do something called cellular respiration. We'll look at that later. How does it do that? Well, it takes the glucose molecule and it breaks it off of the glycogen. And now the muscle cell can use that glucose to create more energy. Needs more energy, it breaks off another glucose. So you're taking something complex and breaking it down. That's a decomposition. Right? Single replacement and double replacement reactions, what they refer to as exchange reactions, all right, or displacement reactions. Right? Things like adenosine triphosphate and adenosine diphosphate, ATP and ADP, right, where you are taking a phosphate group maybe from ATP and you're adding it onto glucose. Right? That is something that we also see during cell respiration, right, during glycolysis of cell respiration. Here's 3 phosphate groups, adenosine triphosphate, 1, 2, 3, right, and during cell respiration, ATP comes in, releases one of these phosphate groups, and it gets attached to the glucose. Right? It's what we refer to as glucose phosphate because it has a phosphate group attached. Again, we're going to talk more about this in chapter 3 when we get into cell respiration and cell processes. But that's an exchange. Right? That is an exchange. And we'll get into that a little bit more. We'll get into that a little. But know that these types of reactions don't just happen in test tubes in the laboratory. These also happen in real life. It's what drives our metabolism. It's what drives the physiology. So let's kind of go through and talk a little bit. I got about 3 more slides that I want to cover. Let's talk about ionic bonding. We've actually kind of already talked about ionic bonding when we looked at sodium and chlorine joining together. An ionic bond is an attraction between a cation and an anion. It's an attraction between a molecule that is negatively charged and a molecule that is positively charged. Right? It's a connection between a molecule that is negatively charged, what we refer to as an anion, and a molecule that is positively charged. Now, how do you keep those two things straight? I'm going to tell you a lie, but the lie is just to go ahead and have you remember things. Cations are positive. How can you remember that? Because it's got the word cat in there. All right? And we're going to pretend that cats are good. Right? Cats are evil, they're mean, they're hideous, they plot against you, they plot about ways to kill you while you are sleeping by sucking the very soul from your breath as you exhale. Right? Cats are evil. And I know I've got cat lovers in the group. I know. But think about this. Anything that is willing to go outside and kill another living organism and bring it to your doorstep and look at you and say, look how much I love you. I killed this for you. It's evil. When was the last time you dated someone who showed their love for you by going out and killing the neighbor and dropping the neighbor off in the living room and saying, look, I killed Bob. I love you. You wouldn't accept that. But with a cat, you think it's cute. Cats are evil, right? But for the purpose of this illustration, we're going to pretend that the cat is positive. It's good. So cations are positively charged because they've given away an electron. They've helped somebody else. Anions are negative because they've taken what you have thrown away. Right? They've got extra electrons that are attached to them. And so what happens is, right, during this give and take, electrons are transferred from one atom to the next. And the bond happens. All right? The bond happens. Now, this bond can easily be broken, let's say when you add it to water. This is why salt dissolves in water. Pepper does not dissolve in water. Why? Because pepper is not made up of cations and anions. But salt is. Right? Salt absolutely, totally is. And the key here is that this is a transfer of electrons. No sharing. Right? It's kind of like, but the atom comes along for the ride. It's kind of like if I let you use a pen in class because your pen dies. And the rule is, here's the pen. You can use the pen. You can write whatever you want. You can do whatever you want with it. But I have to stay attached. I have no claim to the pen. I can't regulate what you write, what you do with it. You want to pick your ears, pick your nose, clean your teeth. If you want to write notes, if you want to draw smiley faces surrounded by stars, I have no say. But I stay attached to the pen. Does that make sense? That's an ionic bond. Right? And that's exactly what we see here. Right? We can look at this here. Hold on one second. Lost my... Here's sodium with its 11 electrons, right? And it wants to give away that electron because it wants to have a stable valence shell. But when it does that, right, it's going to give it to chlorine, which is desperately in need of one more electron. Right? So it now forms a bond, sodium chloride. Here's something to keep in mind. Here's something to keep in mind. Sodium by itself is deadly. It's explosive. It's a very soft metal that reacts with water. And it reacts with water, even just humidity in the air will cause sodium metal to explode. Sodium can kill you by itself. Chlorine is a gas. Right? If you've ever over-chlorinated the pool and you've gone swimming and when you come up, and if you don't come up far enough, you just come up with just barely out of the water and you take a deep breath in, your lungs burn. Why? Because you just breathed in chlorine gas. Chlorine can kill you. But when we take these two deadly things, sodium, which can explode, and chlorine, which can burn and is caustic, and we join them together, we have the world's most widely used preservative and seasoning, salt. Why? It's a transfer of one electron. One simple electron was transferred. And those two things are now stuck together. If you dissolve it, sodium becomes separate, but it's a sodium ion. It doesn't get to take that electron back. It is an ion. Chlorine gets to keep that electron, and so it is a chloride ion. It doesn't ever go back to being a chlorine atom. It's a chloride ion. Sodium doesn't get to go back and be a sodium atom. It is now a sodium ion. And the clinical contribution to this is we can take these ionically bound salts, and there's a slew of them, and when we split them apart, they are now charged. Sodium has a charge. It's a negative charge. It's a positive charge. Chlorine is a charged molecule. It has a negative charge. We can use those charged ions to create electrical current within the body, and that is what we call an electrolyte. And so your body uses electrolytes to balance osmolarity. It drives water movement in and out of the cells. Electrical currents, what we call action potentials, are generated from the influx of these positively and negatively charged molecules. And when we lose that balance, when your electrolytes have been diluted too much, you can get muscle cramps, coma, heart failure, cardiac arrest, respiratory distress. You can die. You can die. There was a case, this is probably going back 15 years ago in California when the Wii first came out, the Nintendo Wii first came out. Morning show disc jockeys did this shock jock thing in the morning. Who can hold their Wii for a Wii? And this girl came in, 20s, two young small boys at home. She came in with these two guys, and they each had to drink a gallon of water and sit in the studio and hold their Wii. And whoever was the last person left who didn't urinate won the Wii. Hold your Wii for a Wii. Remember what I said in chapter 1, guys are the weaker sex. Guy number 1 taps out. He has to go pee. Now it's just the guy and the girl. Guy number 2 taps out. He's out. The girl wins. She held her Wii longer than the boys, and she won a Wii for her kids, her 2 small young boys at home for Christmas. 3 hours later, she was dead in the emergency room. Cardiac arrest. Why? She diluted her electrolytes to the point where her heart could not conduct electrical current to keep it beating. This has practical implications. You ever go into the emergency room? Okay. What's one of the first things they do when you get back into the examination room? Doctor comes in, they hook you up to saline. What is saline? It's 0.9% sodium chloride. Why? To help try to restore electrolyte balance. That's why. And we're going to talk more about that when we get into osmosis in chapter 3. But there's practical implications to why we do some of the things that we do clinically. Gatorade is all based off of electrolyte balance. It's got salt that's been split apart to try to restore ionic balance within our cells and our tissues. And so I'm going to leave that there for you to go ahead and ponder and think about. And as we do that, keep reviewing, keep jotting down questions, keep asking questions, and have a good time studying. This is not easy. It's in depth. I realize that, but you got this. And I'll catch you on the flip side.